Here's what's coming up today on the Prove Me Wrong podcast.
The film that we see and the photographs that we see taken allegedly on the lunar surface were not taken on the lunar surface. They couldn't have been. The film would not have worked because the film was destroyed in the vacuum of space.
Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. I'm your host, Pete Lieb, and I'm all alone today, but I'm glad that you're all on board for the ride here. We are venturing out into space again today, folks. It's one of my favorite topics, and this time I'll be talking to my guest, Marcus Allen, about whether or not the Apollo moon landings that took place between 1969 and 1972, are they indeed fact, or have they been faked? Are they an elaborate fiction? I personally have danced around the fringes of the topic in previous podcasts. I've already covered the hollow moon theory. I've discussed NASA's plans to reach the moon on a more permanent basis by 2025. So today, I want to start, at least, with the premise that humankind, has landed on the moon. Well, some would argue that there is compelling evidence that suggests that these landings were indeed fiction, and some of the photographs and film footage were elaborately faked, and the truth has been hidden from us. So to help me make that argument today, again, I am lucky to have Marcus Allen with me today. Welcome, Marcus.
Hello, Pete. Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me onto your show. It sounds already very interesting.
I appreciate it. Well, just as a quick bio for you, Marcus. Marcus is the UK publisher of Nexus magazine. Nexus is the world's leading alternative news magazine. It covers health, future science, hidden history, the unexplained, and UFOs. Marcus has appeared on many TV shows during the past 20 years to discuss the Apollo moon landing controversy, including the BBC, Sci-Fi, Discovery Channel, as well as being interviewed on numerous national and local radio shows in the UK and the US, and on Coast to Coast AM, where I've actually heard you before. Okay, so just to get it started, we all want it to be true, Marcus. I guess most of us want it to be true, especially myself, the American we. I live in Florida here. Landing on the moon could be said to be the greatest human achievement of all time, if it actually happened. Unfortunately, there is a lot of evidence that seems to contradict that, and again, that's why we have you on today. So I know we could jump right in and start talking about photographs and films and things like that, but the way my brain works, I want to start at the beginning and start with technology limitations in 1969 and just kind of reset what we were doing as a human race technologically in 1969, especially with regards to rocket technology. Did we have the ability, in your mind, to break out of Earth orbit to make it 240,000 miles and plant ourselves on the moon, which is the common history?
We certainly had the technology to reach the moon because that had been done, first of all, by the Soviet Union, as it was called then, the Russian Federation as it is now. That was done in 1959. They launched a rocket, they had a camera on board, and they flew round the moon and photographed the far side of the moon. And it was necessary, obviously, for the United States to at least equal something like that, because there are probably enough of your listeners who are old enough to remember the famous Cold War. Mm-hmm. And there was a space race going on, and the space race was who could get to the moon first. So there were certainly craft that could reach the moon. That's not in dispute. That's not doubt. What I doubt is that humans could reach the moon. Now, us humans, we're fairly delicate little creatures. We have to be protected from the radiation of space, and we're protected very well here on Earth by the atmosphere of the Earth, the 60 miles of atmosphere above our heads. And that protects us from a considerable amount of radiation. Above the atmosphere, there is something called the Van Allen radiation belts, named after Professor James Van Allen of Iowa University, who was the first person to confirm their existence. They'd been theoretically proposed prior to that, and the International Geophysical Year in 1958, one of the things that was done was to confirm the presence of the Van Allen radiation belts. And it was done very simply, by the simple expedient of mounting a Geiger counter on top of one of the very first American rockets, Explorer 1, that was shot up into space, primarily to establish whether these radiation belts actually existed. Far more radiation in space than anybody had anticipated. So on Explorer 4, another Geiger counter was sent up, and it identified not just one radiation belt, but two of them. In fact, there are three, but that didn't come till a bit later. Now, we don't really know what level of radiation was being recorded. All we know is that a considerable amount of radiation appears to be in space. Now, this is generated by the sun. I mean, that's not really a problem.
Let me ask you a question, if you don't mind. Are these Van Allen radiation belts, are they the same thickness all around? Are there softer spots? Are there thinner spots to the belts themselves?
Right. If you could imagine the Earth as a sort of donut. No, the Earth is the center of a donut. It's the center hole of a donut. The radiation belts will appear to be, will surround the Earth. They follow the magnetic lines of the Earth. The Earth has a magnetic field by the iron core. And these magnetic lines, they leave the Earth at the poles. They leave it, say, at the North Pole and re-enter at the South Pole. Hence, you've got a pole on a magnet, a North and South Pole. And at the poles, the radiation would be rather more severe than it would be, say, at the equator. So the logical explanation would be that you launch your rocket so that you will skirt around these radiation belts so that you don't expose not only the rockets and the electronics on board, but the humans inside. Because these rockets that were launched to the moon, the Apollo craft, they didn't carry any radiation protection. The astronauts didn't have any radiation protection in their spacesuits, either in the craft or even allegedly walking around on the moon, because I asked them. And the answer from the manufacturers of the spacesuit, a company called International Latex Corporation, and they said, no, we built the spacesuits according to the specification that NASA supplied us. Better ask them. So I did. I'm still waiting for the reply. And that was 20 years ago.
That was my other question, was those radiation belts actually protect us in low orbit, right? I mean, they restrict the amount of radiation in a low Earth orbit, but once you get past them, there's no protection, right? I mean, it's not like the radiation gets lower outside of the radiation belts, right? Or what is the radiation levels outside of the belts?
Yeah, no, that's correct. In fact, beyond the radiation belts, just to answer your original question, low Earth orbit, where the space station flies, where the space shuttle flew, where the most activity takes place or has taken place, is about 200 miles above the Earth's surface. The inner radiation belt starts at about 700 or 800 miles above the Earth's surface and extends for about 5,000 miles. Then there's a gap, and then we have the outer radiation belts, which start at about 10,000 miles and extend out to about 25,000 miles. Now, beyond the radiation belts, you're exposed to all the radiation in space. That's galactic cosmic rays, which come from deep space. That's solar particle events, which are solar flares. All of the radiation which we know exists in space. There's no dispute about it. I mean, this is a physical scientific fact that there is radiation in space. The question, which is always quite difficult to answer, is how much of that radiation exists and how much is it in relation to humans? How would it damage humans?
Yeah, that was always what was in my brain, is that the sticking point was getting past the belts. But once you got past the belts, you were in space. The belts actually protected the Earth from the radiation. Once you got past them, there is no protection. I was always really miffed by that the belts seem to be, well, that's the problem. We have to get past the belts and then we're fine. Well, no, you're not fine. You're still out there in a radioactive environment with no protection.
Yes, exactly. That's a key point. Most people think of the radiation belts as existing where they do. They say they go up to about 25,000 miles above the Earth's surface. And once you're past them, it's sort of, like getting past the speed limit. You can go as fast as you like because there won't be any damage. No.
Exactly. What always stuck with me is I saw a NASA scientist, and I can't think of his name, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, when they had asked him about going back to the moon. And his statement was, well, you don't have the technology to do that now. We used to, we don't now. And so you just kind of said that we had the technology in 1969. What do you make of the statement that we had that technology in 69 to go there. But now a NASA scientist is telling us we no longer have the technology to return.
That's right. That was Don Pettit who made the statement.
Yes, thank you. Was that just a moment where he just kind of let the cat out of the bag without realizing it, or was that...
No, he was being quite honest.
Right.
Because I think the question originally asked of him was, would you like to go to the moon?
That's right.
And he said, I'd go in a nanosecond. But we can't because we destroyed the technology, which seems a very strange thing to do. Now, to some people, that might imply, well, we had the technology, but we destroyed it for whatever reason, so we could have reached the moon. No, that's not the point. The point was that the technology he was referring to was the technology to take humans to the moon. Mm-hmm. And this is always the major debating point. It's perfectly possible to reach the moon, and it's been done quite regularly. There have been many craft that have gone to the moon, but they're all unmanned, i.e. there's no astronaut on board. And this is the major difference. Getting to the moon isn't actually too much of a problem. It's getting humans to the moon that's the real problem, and then getting them back again, which is an even bigger problem. Now, he then made the rather strange comment, well, it did exist, but we destroyed it.
Right.
What? Hang on a minute. What do you mean destroyed it? What's going on here? So what was destroyed? Was it the Saturn V rocket? Was it the lunar lander that was destroyed, which landed humans on the moon? Mm-hmm. What we're being asked to believe is that a rocket-firing craft landed on the moon, and another rocket-firing craft took off from the moon with the two astronauts on board, met up with the orbiting command module, orbiting about 60 miles above the lunar surface, and the three astronauts then returned to a hero's welcome back here on Earth. Well, that's the story.
And then you watch their press conference when they came back. They did not seem to me like conquering heroes when they returned and answering questions. They looked like they were either incredibly afraid or they were just flat out lying, or they didn't like having to say what they were saying. It just seemed disingenuous all around.
It's an excellent point you make about that, because you would expect somebody returning from such a world-beating achievement.
Right.
The first men to land on the moon, and we saw it live on television, so we knew it all happened. And here they come back, and they basically look like they're naughty schoolboys who've been caught smoking behind the bike sheds, as we say in the UK. They'd done something wrong. Mm-hmm. They don't look like people who were proud of what they'd achieved. Now, people try to explain all this, and there's an interesting sort of phenomenon that goes on with the discussion about Apollo. There's always some counter-argument. There's always something which can be said in defense of Apollo when people like myself challenge NASA to explain how they did something. And people say, well, look, these astronauts don't look like they're conquering heroes returning to world fame. They look like they're embarrassed about it.
Right.
Now, the counter-explanation to that is, well, they were never trained to be public people. They were pilots, they were astronauts, their training was involved in piloting a craft to the moon and back. You can't expect them to sit down in front of the world's press and behave like celebrities. No, that just doesn't add up. These are people who were trained. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were representing, one prefers to think of it as the human race,
right,
venturing out into space. But they appear to think they just returned from a mission over Korea or Vietnam, and they shot a few planes down, and they're being debriefed on their return.
They look to me more like men of integrity who were being forced to say something they didn't believe or didn't want to, and they didn't like it.
It certainly looks that way. And just as an extra point on that, you may remember the famous sequence where Bart Sibrel confronted Buzz Aldrin.
Yes.
And accused him of being a cheat, a thief, and a liar, and Buzz Aldrin
punched him in the face, yeah.
In fact, Bart Sibrel has since apologized to Buzz Aldrin for that confrontation. But that's not the point. The point is that what he was trying to do, he was walking around, he was trying to meet all the astronauts who had allegedly walked on the moon, offering them a Bible to swear on that they had actually walked on the lunar surface. And they didn't. They wouldn't do it. Neil Armstrong definitely refused to do it, even though he was offered $5,000 for a charity of his choice if he would swear on the Bible he was being offered that he had walked on the lunar surface. And he turned on his heels and walked away. Now, one could make the case that if you swear on a Bible you're making a legal statement, because such a statement can be used in court as evidence.
Right.
But if I had walked on the lunar surface, as he is alleged to have done, and somebody had asked me to swear on a Bible that I'd done it, I'd say, of course I will. How many Bibles have you got? Let's have a stack of them. Of course I walked on the moon. Of course I'll swear on a Bible. Why don't you believe me? There were some very strange reactions to this. Obviously, it is very well known what swearing on a Bible means, and maybe they just didn't want to commit themselves to something like that. I don't know. I wasn't there. I can only judge it from what I've seen on recordings and on pictures and on film.
Okay, so we've gone through the fact that I don't think either one of us believe that they would have survived just the radiation of space in general. Let's say they did.
That's right.
Let's say they made the landing. Now they've come out of the lunar module. What always stuck to me, every time I've ever tried to think this through, Apollo 11 was the first time they have done this. They've actually landed the lander, crawled out of it. They danced around for 21 hours or so, got back inside, and took off. We've already established that. The first time you do something with such grave consequences and you're filming it, that's what always stuck to me is, how are you filming that first time when you don't know what to expect? You have no idea what's waiting for you up there in reality. You can kind of guess, but you don't know. In one slip, one fall, you tear your suit and you are dying on national television. That would be horrific. So my point was always, why can't both things, or why couldn't both things be true? That maybe, yes, they went to the moon and did what they said they did. And yes, the footage of it and the photographs of it were faked so that they could do their mission on the moon without this added pressure of trying to film it and acting for the camera. And they can play the camera footage at the same time. And so then they can actually say, yes, we were there, and the American people could see the visual proof. But I just couldn't get around, you would do that, take such a risk on your first trip in space. This is not, just riding across the street on your bike for the first time. I mean, this is going into space where you are sure death if you tear your suit.
That's true. That's a good point. Because obviously nobody had been to the moon before.
Right.
But the point about that is that there have been a lot of simulation exercises, training and simulation exercises conducted right across America. Because obviously if you're going to a place you've never been to before, you want to simulate it in as great a detail as you can. That was the purpose behind the lunar orbiter craft, to photograph the lunar surface, so they could recreate as accurately as possible the places that they hoped to be able to land. Basically, that was the purpose of the lunar orbiters, to photograph the lunar surface and the landing sites and select the landing sites in considerable detail. And they were photographed in really quite considerable detail, down to about 2 or 3 feet. They could identify individual rocks on the lunar surface. I've seen the photographs the lunar orbiter craft took, and they would then recreate that in a simulation set. Now, you're going to simulate it as accurately as possible. You're also going to film and photograph it.
Right.
You can debrief people. You say, oh, don't put your foot there, Buzz, you'll fall off. Do it there. Don't do that, because that's not going to be in shot. So, that's what's called debriefing. And you've got to film it. Now, on the Apollo 11, which is probably the most famous of the missions, the one that most people are familiar with,
right,
there was a TV camera which photographed the astronauts coming down the ladder. It was a TV camera. It was built by Westinghouse, and it was on a little shelf that was lowered down, pointing in the right general direction. So you didn't need anybody to film it. It was being filmed automatically.
Okay.
That was the camera which, once they'd got onto the surface. By the way, the astronauts were on the surface for just over 2 hours. They spent 21 hours on the lunar surface. That TV camera was the one that was then carried away from the craft, set up on a little stick so that they could be photographed as they were carrying out whatever activity they wanted to do, which was planting the flag and talking to the president and collecting some rocks. But inside the lunar lander was a film camera. I mentioned that there was a problem in space with filming.
Right.
And the problem is the vacuum that exists in space. That photographic film cannot survive in a vacuum. It becomes very brittle, Now, I mentioned the lunar orbiter, which had photographic film on board, and it photographed the lunar surface. And I said, I've seen the photographs. So it obviously took the photographs. And it was only quite recently where I was listening to a very interesting explanation from one of the people involved in the manufacture of the Hexagon spy satellite. Hexagon spy satellite was launched in 1969 to photograph the Soviet Union so we could see what it was that they were doing. It was to do with the Cold War and did they have as many rockets as we thought they did. It used photographic film. The film all had to be pressurized. Not very much, about 1 pound per square inch pressure, in order to ensure the survival of the film. I thought, hang on a minute, I haven't heard that film needed to be pressurized in a vacuum. So I then checked out the lunar orbiter, and I checked out the construction of the lunar orbiter and compared it to the construction of the Hexagon spy satellite, and all the film and photographic material on board was contained within or housed within a pressurized container, pressurized at 1 pound per square inch, using nitrogen gas. So if you can't use photographic film in a hard vacuum, i.e. on the moon, unless the camera and the film is pressurized, the next question which arises is, were the Hasselblad cameras and the Maurer film cameras pressurized? Answer, no, they were not. So how was the film protected? Answer, it wasn't. So the film that we see and the photographs that we see taken allegedly on the lunar surface were not taken on the lunar surface. They couldn't have been. The film would not have worked because the film was destroyed in the vacuum of space. They were taken here on Earth under controlled studio conditions during the training and simulation exercises, more than likely.
Yeah, because when I'm looking at a couple of those photographs, it definitely looks like there are rock formations in the background of pictures that are identical. In one picture, it'll be a rock formation with the lunar lander in the foreground, and the next picture, it's the same rock formation in the background without the lunar lander, but with one of the astronauts. And so it definitely seems like there was kind of just a recycle of a background or a recycle of a set piece, and they're just taking different photographs. Did you have a problem with, and I don't know the science of it, did you have a problem with the big picture was you can't see any stars? I don't know if that's a real phenomenon or not. I just wanted to kind of bounce that off you while I was there. Right. Would you see stars from the moon?
If you were standing on the lunar surface, you would, and you looked up, you would see stars. There's no doubt about that. But those stars will not feature in any photograph.
Okay.
Because you've got to get the exposure correct for the film, or you won't get the photograph you're looking for. So you make sure you get the exposure right. Now, if you're on the lunar surface, let's say, you have very brightly illuminated surface of the moon. It's being illuminated directly by the sun. And your astronaut, if he's standing looking into the sun, yes, you can photograph him. But the exposure will be such that it will not record the stars that obviously are existing in the sky, because the film isn't sensitive enough to record dark surface material and relatively light starlight. If you point the camera straight up in the sky and expose it for the stars alone, not to the moon's surface, yes, you could photograph them.
Okay.
But that never happened. And while we're on the subject of things which people dispute, there are no waving flags on the moon either. NASA were not stupid enough to have a flag flapping about in the wind because they left the studio door open, as some people claim. The flag was being moved, certainly, by the astronauts. They were moving it back and forth, trying to drive it into the ground. That is the only time it moved. Well, it's not quite true. There are a couple of hard-to-find images of astronauts walking past a flag, not touching it, walking past a flag where the flag does appear to move, as if it is being moved by, shall we say, air.
Right.
Or possibly static electricity. It appears on Apollo 14, it appears on Apollo 15, and on Apollo 17. If you go through the photographic or the film record, you can find these. They're not particularly persuasive. So my view is that there are no waving flags on the moon because somebody left the studio door open. And this is what most of the people trying to support Apollo, they're forever banging on about being no stars in the sky and how they've debunked all these people. No, of course there are no stars in the sky in the photographs. Of course there are no waving flags on the moon. There are some strange shadow angles, But you do have to look for them. You have to know what you're looking for, because if the lunar surface was illuminated by the sun, which it's supposed to be, shadows would behave in a very similar way to the way they behave here on Earth. They will converge towards each other. If you stand with your back towards the sun, you will see your own shadow, and you will see shadows of objects in front of you, and those shadows will appear to diverge very slightly away from each other, because that is an artifact of a single lens camera. We've got two eyes, and we compensate for that because we know that the shadows should be parallel. But a camera doesn't know it. The camera's very stupid. It records what it sees. And it's always said that the camera doesn't lie, and that's correct. The camera doesn't lie, but it only has one viewpoint. We have two viewpoints. We have two eyes. So we have a stereoscopic vision. A camera has one view, monovision.
So there needed to be pressurization for the film. What pressurization needed to be for the astronauts? How pressurized did the inside of the suit have to be?
It's surprisingly low, actually. It's about, right, atmospheric pressure, what we're sitting in right now, is 14.7 pounds per square inch. That's the weight of the atmosphere above every square inch on Earth. And there's 60 miles of atmosphere, so it's quite a bit. In order for humans to survive, you need a minimum of 3.8 pounds per square inch. And that is the pressure inside a spacesuit.
Okay.
If it's less than that, then what happens is that the fluids in the body start to outgas. We would call it boil. So astronauts have to be pressurized in their spacesuit.
How did they cool the suits? I mean, they're in the sunlight all day, and I'm assuming that it had to be incredibly hot. How were they kept cool?
It was hot, you're quite right. The explanation for that is that they had inside their suit, which was made of several different layers of very varying material, micrometeorite protection, insulation. But one of the first garments they would put on as a form of long johns was a suit which contained tubing which carried water through it to remove the heat from inside a spacesuit, because humans find it very difficult to operate successfully, and the astronauts obviously had to operate very successfully in temperatures much above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So they would have to remove the excess heat. Now, if you're standing on the lunar surface, you have the full energy of the sun, because there's no atmosphere to diffuse the radiant energy of the sun. It's coming straight at you. So you have to remove the heat. You also got to do the same thing in the spacecraft. The spacecraft was standing on the lunar surface in full sunlight. Now, most people will say, oh, but the moon was just like the Earth. You know, they landed early in the morning. Therefore, the sun was not as nearly as powerful as it would be if they were landed during lunchtime, which is nonsense. Because on the moon, because there is no atmosphere, the radiant energy of the sun will strike the craft, in this case, or the astronaut, or anything on the lunar surface, as soon as the sun becomes visible over the horizon. If the sun becomes visible over the horizon, its full energy is directed onto whatever it hits, in this case, a spacecraft.
Well, let me follow up in terms of the audio transmission. How did they get the audio transmission powerful enough to reach the 240,000 miles from the astronauts that were on the lunar surface back to the Earth?
That's a very good point. It's a very good point, and there's something I can follow that up on. To be honest, radio transmission isn't really too much of a problem because it can be relatively weak. Now, the power source on the Apollo craft, on all of the Apollo craft, were batteries. There weren't any solar panels. There weren't any fuel cells. There were fuel cells in the command module, but not in the lunar land. They carried batteries, big truck batteries. That's what they were, 29 volts. So they were quite powerful batteries. Whether they had enough power, not only to transmit across the 240,000 miles back to Earth, but also to run all the equipment that was necessary to keep the craft working. But another point on that is, what power would be required to transmit a television picture across that distance? And that has never been satisfactorily answered. And I claim that it wasn't. There wasn't enough power.
That was always a sticking point for me, just from the standpoint of, I can't pick up your favorite radio station here, but yet they're transmitting a signal from the moon to the Earth, which is significantly farther away than your favorite radio station there to here in Florida. how big did the transmitter have to be, or the power source have to be able to make that happen? And weight was an issue, right? They had to make sure that there wasn't every pound of weight was fuel, was a potential cost, right?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it cost, I forget what the figure was, about $1,000 to launch 1 pound of weight.
Right. So there were also ham radio operators all over the world that were able to pick up the transmissions. What were they listening to, in your opinion?
They were listening to a retransmission from an orbiting satellite. And NASA did launch a satellite called the Tetra-A, Testing and Training Satellite, it was called. It was launched, it was known to launch, there was no secret about it, in order that all the technicians at in a famous command center at Houston in Texas could practice what to do. And they would have this stuff being transmitted down to them from this satellite, and they would do a simulation. I mean, they were doing real-time simulations. The Apollo 11 mission lasted 8 days. It was launched on July the 16th, and it came back 8 days later. So an 8-day simulation was required. But if you're going to do a proper simulation, you've got to have all the transmission of information coming from your spacecraft. And that was done. I said it was recorded during the training and simulation exercises that were done earlier. It was then utilized. And there were huge computers at the back of that control room at Houston, which used all this information and transmitted it in the time it was required to be transmitted. So I don't think there's too much doubt that it was being done because they were practicing. Each mission had a real-time simulation. So the story about the ham radio operators is always very interesting because it's always said, oh, the ham radio operators were listening in. Mm-hmm. Except there's one major problem with that, is that the transmissions from the Apollo craft were being transmitted in the gigahertz range, which is very, very small wavelength. And ham radio operators could only receive megahertz transmission. They didn't have the equipment to receive a gigahertz transmission. The idea that they were listening in, and now I've heard the stories, I've heard many of these stories. So the ham radio operators were allegedly listening in to the Apollo craft, and they matched some of the transmission with the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal record of the full transmissions of what the Apollo craft was saying. I don't doubt that they were listening into something, but I don't think they were listening into the Apollo craft on the lunar surface.
Are you as worried about, as I was, about just kind of the cavalier way that these astronauts were running around on the surface of the moon? Maybe it is because they, like to your point, they've been through dozens of simulations. You know, they've had a mapped surface. They kind of know what they're doing. But I was really nervous whenever I watched that, with the way that they were moving around and running around. And to me, I would have been much more careful and metered in my approach and in my steps. Again, just knowing that if I fall awkwardly, or if I fall in a way that tears the suit somehow or punctures the suit somehow, it could be catastrophic.
Oh, absolutely, yes. It would certainly be catastrophic.
Right.
In fact, it would take about 20 minutes to kill somebody if their suit got a hole in it, because all the air would go out and their blood would boil. It's the same thing that divers get when they come up too quickly from deep sea diving. If they come up too quickly, the gases in their bloods cannot be redissolved back into the bloodstream fast enough, and so they get into the joints and they get what's called the bends. The same thing would happen in space. I thought it was really weird the way that they would run around and the amount of times they fell. I mean, they fell dozens of times, yes,
and just kind of jumping around. And to me, any one of those falls could have been fatal.
Let's just have a look at something here, because you're quite right to say that would be, if you're going to somewhere as dangerous as the lunar surface, let's say you go there for real, because I don't think Apollo was real. Mm-hmm. If you go there for real, you're going to be very, very careful.
Absolutely.
You're going to make sure that every footstep you take is going to be secure before you put your weight on it, because you don't know until you've tried it whether there's going to be a big dust bowl under your foot and you're going to sink in about 10 foot and get buried. You don't know that until you tried it. Obviously, they would try to make sure that there wasn't any great big dust bowls, because we know that the lunar surface is very dusty. Now, what you've got is a major anomaly here. You've got something which is really, again, unexplained. You see all these astronauts jumping about, behaving as if they're out for a Sunday afternoon picnic.
Absolutely.
They're singing songs and they're jumping about and they're hopping around and they're sort of moving in a bit of an unnatural way, sort of hopping around, bunny hopping around, I think they called it.
Right.
So they move faster. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of a YouTube film that was posted about 2 or 3 years ago called Make Believe, Smoke and Mirrors. It's a film that lasts about 2 hours 44. It's 2 hours 44 minutes long.
Mm-hmm.
What it attempts to do is explain how the whole Apollo deception was carried out and the different speeds of the film that we used, the actors that we used, the models that we used, because that lunar rover was a model, a radio-controlled model. A lot of the astronauts, if you examine the photographs in considerable detail, you see that the astronaut, though he appears to have moved, his body is in exactly the same position as a previous image of the same astronaut, but on a different location. There's some very weird things going on. I say, this film was posted a while ago. I don't think it's available widely on the internet. I think it was taken down. There are several websites which actually do have it available. The point is that it demonstrated how the whole thing was done, how it was all manipulated, using models, using mannequins, using quite advanced film techniques where you've got different sizes of films, where you've got optical printers so you can print out certain sequences at certain speeds, because there are various different speeds. It's not all slow motion. It's not filmed at real time and then projected back at a slower speed so it appears to be in slow motion. It's not that. It's much more sophisticated than that. The use of, because we don't have very many reference points in these moon photographs, in the Apollo photographs, we accept them. We accept what we see as being reality on the moon. We watched it on television. We tend to go along with it and believe it. But I've seen 80-foot gorillas climb the Empire State Building.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen dinosaurs chase kids around kitchens in Jurassic Park. Very convincing. King Kong was done in the 1920s originally. It was used rather crude special effects. The more recent film was using very, very good special effects. Special effects are a technology which is very well understood now. There are various ways in which audiences can be persuaded to watch something that in reality would not occur. So you use green screen, you use back projection, and it comes across on a two-dimensional screen image as being persuasive, and we go along with it and we believe it. Apollo deception live on television, we say to ourselves, well, it must have happened the way we've been shown.
Let me ask you this also, because I get Apollo 11. I get the feeling that we needed to win the quote-unquote space race. We needed to put someone there. If this was a deception, why the others? Why would they continue to have this deception go on? Why add 10 more people into the mix, keeping the lie? What was the point of that?
Okay, that's an excellent point. It's actually a very 21st century question, that one. Though it was asked at the time. There were 9 Apollo missions, of which 6 of them landed, 3 didn't. Apollo 8 didn't land, that orbited the moon in December 1968. Apollo 10 came a little bit later, and that was to test the full-up rocket and the full equipment. Apollo 11 landed, 12 landed, 13 we know didn't land. Great piece of space opera writing, that one. 14, 15, 16, and 17, and then it stopped. There were supposed to be 3 more missions after that, 18, 19, and 20, and they got cancelled by the then President Nixon because, we've been there, as President Obama said, been there, done that, don't need to do it again.
I never understood that either, because the amount of resources, the moon composition is not the same as the Earth composition. There seems to me to be that there is opportunity there. If we had continued that, and I know they say, well, the money wasn't there, the funds weren't there, where we wanted to go as a government changed, and the public was no longer interested, and so we went on to the next thing. But it seems to me like there is a lot of potential resource and opportunity there that we could have made better use of. And I think that's actually part of what President Trump here now is why he's making that claim now that by 2025 we will be back on the moon and we'll have a more permanent presence there by 2028 and create some type of mining habitation scenario there. I just don't understand why they would say, okay, we ran out of money, there's no longer interest in it, and we're done, and never again.
Well, that's the explanation normally offered. Oh, why haven't we been back? Well, we ran out of money, there was no interest. All that sort of stuff. Absolute nonsense. There was plenty of money. Yeah, forget running out of money. There was plenty of money if they wanted to direct it there. Whether Congress was prepared to direct it there or not is another matter. And they may have been persuaded that they shouldn't be directing it there. But you make a very good point that there is a great deal of resource on the moon. There's a great deal of information that we could acquire on the moon. Mm-hmm. We need to go back there. Now, you mentioned President Trump has directed NASA to return humans to the moon. I think it's 2024, I think is the first one. So It's not very far away. I mean, we're talking about 4 years' time. And my particular view on that is that President Trump is aware of certain shortcomings at NASA. He's not prepared to call them out on it, but he wants them to be appearing to do what he's directed as the President of the United States. He has every right to do that. He's directed NASA to return to the lunar surface. It's called the Artemis program. If Trump knows more than he's saying, he wants NASA to trip themselves up.
Right.
If NASA come back and say, oh, we need more money, oh, we need more time, oh, we're not ready to go yet, he's going to say, well, look, you did it 9 times in the 60s. What's the problem today with the 21st century technology? Get on with it, guys. Now, Trump doesn't have much tolerance for incompetence.
True.
But he's prepared to allow NASA to show themselves up if they didn't do it before. Because if they could do it with the technology of the 1960s, which, let's face it, is not as good as the technology of the 21st century, I think most people would agree with that. In order to return to the moon with humans, now we got a real problem. But we did it in the 1960s. 12 humans walked on the lunar surface. Another 6 of them orbited the moon. What's the problem, guys? So in December 2014, the Orion craft was launched, and it was to return to the moon. And this was the craft they were going to do it in. And they were going to go on to Mars as well. Oh, forget Mars. That's not going to happen. In December 2014, they launched this craft for its first test flight. It was sent 3,600 miles out from the Earth's surface and returned back again, basically to test the heat shield, because that is one of the key features of all craft returning from lunar orbit. You have to have a heat shield. The heat shield is made of what's called ablative material, which basically means it destroys itself and not the craft it's protecting. The ablative material on the Orion craft virtually failed. So why didn't they just use what was used on Apollo?
Right.
Because they couldn't find the formula. And we're now in November 2019, that's 5 years later, and there's been no other test of the Orion craft at lunar orbit return speed, 25,000 miles an hour. What's going on? 5 years is almost the length of time it took Apollo to get the whole thing from standing start up to working speed. It's as if they didn't know what they're doing, and I think this is the problem NASA now have. They're beginning to discover that it never happened the way we were told it happened. They're beginning to discover that Apollo was basically a deception. It was a brilliantly executed propaganda exercise.
What about the landing sites? What about those 6 landing sites on the moon? That's another point that the debunkers will make. They'll say you can see the landing sites on the moon with a large telescope or with a powerful telescope, and they'll try to point them out to us.
Yes, this is one of the most wonderful pieces of misdirection I've ever heard. You can't see it with a telescope. Photographs taken of the lunar landing sites were taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, an unmanned spacecraft flying above the lunar surface, photographing the lunar surface, as I say, photographing it yet again. It was flying at about, I think the original orbit was about 25 kilometers, which is about 15 miles, using 21st century technology. This was launched in 2009, 10 years ago, and it photographed the lunar landing sites, and we were shown pictures of what purported to be the lunar landers on the lunar surface and other pieces of equipment. And we were even told that we could see the flags that were planted on the lunar surface. Now, you couldn't actually see the flags because they wouldn't be there. They would be destroyed. If they ever were there in the first place, they'd be destroyed by the ultraviolet light and the radiation. They'd have gone away. And we know that for a fact because on the Mir space station, the Soviet Union space station, they actually put a Soviet flag outside the space station. I don't know who was supposed to see it, but they did. And when the space station was decommissioned, they thought, well, better get the flag back. So they went outside to have a look. They couldn't find it. It had disappeared. Micrometeorites, ultraviolet light, nothing left. So on the lunar surface, now forget seeing flags. You're not going to see a flag. But you're also not going to see a lunar lander taken from 15 miles away. The orbit of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2009 was lowered down to 25 kilometers so they could get the detailed pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at these detailed pictures, what do you see? You see basically a few white pixels and a few black pixels. You can't see anything specific. Now, if you look at your house on Google Maps, you know that was taken from either a high-flying aircraft or an orbiting satellite. I've looked at orbiting satellites above the Earth, photographing objects here on Earth, and one of the pictures I use is of the London Eye. And this was taken by, I think it was the GeoEye-1 satellite. Now, that is an orbiting satellite photographing 400 kilometers above the Earth's surface, through all the dust and pollution of the Earth's atmosphere, and you can see individual cars on the London Eye, and near to it is a car park, and you can see in that car park individual cars. You can even see if the car has a sunroof, so you know which way the car is pointing. On the lunar surface, the lunar landers were much larger than the average car. They were about 20 foot high, about 20 foot across. They were quite large objects. That was the bit that was left on the lunar surface, because the astronauts were in the top half of the lunar lander. That was the bit that took off. They weren't taken with any telescope here on Earth, because no telescope is powerful enough to see something 20 foot across from Earth on the moon.
Yeah, you're right about that. I can see my pool in the backyard of my house from space. You know, you can just continue to zoom in and zoom in and zoom in. And why wouldn't you take that same type of film technology, photographic technology, if you're going to go up there and film those sites? Why wouldn't you take that same level of technology up there? Why would you take technology that would not allow you to even see it from 15 miles away?
Because if you're using Photoshop, which I think is what was done here, if you're using Photoshop, you want to make sure that it looks convincing enough without putting in enough detail. Because from 25 kilometers above the lunar surface, photographing through the vacuum of space, there would be no distortion, no degradation of the image. It would be perfectly possible to see considerable detail, as you say, using 21st century technology, which is what was being done, but they don't want us to see that. And they even say you can see footprints on the lunar surface. Well, not footprints, you can see tracks on the lunar surface, where the astronaut is allegedly walking along. But those tracks appear almost as wide as the lunar lander. So what were they, giants or something?
Well, from 15 miles away, with the technology that we use for Google Maps, you should be able to see the bags of waste that they left behind. I mean, it should be that zoomed in. You should have that much ability.
Yeah, of course you should. That's exactly the point. And people try to get around this by saying, oh, they were just showing the general image. They weren't showing the detail. Well, why not?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, show the proper detail. Because if those photographs showed what we're told is supposedly on the lunar surface, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But I need to be convinced is a genuine photograph and not a photoshopped image, which I think it is.
That's your opportunity right there to put all of this to bed. You go in there and you can say, here are the 6 sites. We utilized 21st century technology. You can zoom right in on it.
Yeah, you can see all that we told you was there.
Right.
Somebody like me would then shut up and go away with my tail between my legs and not say another word about it. But I'm not convinced. I'm totally unconvinced by these ridiculously stupid images which NASA are trying to persuade us are images of the lunar landers. I don't believe it. I don't believe a word of it. I think NASA are being caught out. They're desperately trying to catch up with a lot of the questions that have been raised. One of the points I made about rockets taking off and trying to avoid the Van Allen radiation belts, and they skimmed around the edge of the Van Allen belt so they weren't exposed to so much radiation. Mm-hmm. That explanation was put forward, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago. It first featured as an explanation for how to avoid the Van Allen belts, because so many people were asking, well, how do you avoid the radiation? And that was NASA's explanation. Now, they made a mistake, because they said, well, we skirted around the edge of the belt. Okay, that's a reasonable explanation, and I can understand that. But in order to skirt around the edge of the belt, you have to launch your craft on a polar orbit, not an equatorial orbit. All Apollo craft were launched from Cape Canaveral in Florida, quite near where you are, and they fly out over the Atlantic, and they go over Africa, over Mauritania. It then heads east over India, over the Pacific Ocean, background over America, and so on and so on. That's an equatorial orbit.
Well, how can they push that explanation forward when we have the telemetry, right? We have the actual course that they went in 1969. How are they trying to push that when we actually have the route that was taken?
Exactly. That is one of the problems, that they will say, no, we launched from Florida, and we went out over Africa. Yeah, that's a logical thing. If you're going to go to the moon, that's a reasonable thing to do, because you fly around the Earth a couple of times, fire a rocket again when you're basically in a position to reach the moon, because you can see where the moon is. It's not very far away in space compared to Mars. And you'll land on the moon 3 days later, assuming you got it right. You're going to skirt around these famous Van Allen belts by going on a polar orbit. How on earth are you going to get to the moon? It makes no sense. And if you start deconstructing some of NASA's rather more ridiculous answers, but NASA have a fan club who support NASA's position on all occasions.
Why would the other countries, though, support that? Why would not? I mean, I'm assuming at that time in 1969 that every country in the world was watching this Apollo takeoff, was watching the progress. If it wasn't happening the way they say it was, or if it didn't happen, why would Russia, for one, why would they keep that secret?
Good point. Just 2 points on that. Yes, millions of people were watching Apollo. We're told it was 600 million people were watching it. We were all watching the same thing. Every single person here on Earth was watching the transmission put together by NASA. So why didn't the Russians blow the whistle if they thought it was fake?
Right.
Because they had no reason at that time to believe it was fake. And anyway, they had faked enough of their own space missions. It is always said that if it was fake, the Russians would have blown the whistle.
Right.
Who in Russia would, at the time, we're talking 1969, 1970s, who would have blown the whistle? The main driving force behind the Soviet space program was a chap called Sergei Korolev. He had died quite suddenly. I think he'd had a kidney problem, and anyway, he died. There was nobody there who could take his place because nobody had been trained up. Who would have had the influence to be able to go to the Politburo, to the head of the Presidium of the Soviet Union, and persuade them that America were fooling the world? There was probably nobody who could do it. Nobody who could present a persuasive enough case for the Soviet Union to then announce publicly that America were faking it, because the immediate reaction would have been, oh, it's just sour grapes because we got there first.
Just a couple of final questions here. We're getting near the end of our time.
Okay.
So I've had this conversation with my father, for one, and it obviously brings out a lot of passion in people, and it's understandable. You know, there's a definite sense of pride within America, especially with this accomplishment. And his point to me was always, why would these astronauts lie? Why would Neil Armstrong lie? Why would Buzz Aldrin lie? These men were American heroes. They had a lot of integrity by all accounts. Why would they, and the other 10 individuals who walked on the moon, why would they lie about it? And why would they keep that quiet essentially for the rest of their lives?
Okay, that's a major point, actually. It's a major point, because that is what we believe. These are American heroes.
Right.
And most people do not like to think that their heroes have feet of clay. One point, all astronauts, including Armstrong, were military. Armstrong was a very good pilot. Why would this rather strange situation be there, that you have these publicly known, very well known, they had contracts with Life magazine, National Geographic followed them in all occasions. Why would they lie? I said they're all military men. They're all bound by their oaths of office and their oaths of secrecy. Military men tend to support each other. And when their commander-in-chief, in this case the president, gives an order, if they're ordered to jump, they have one question, how high, sir? They don't question the order. If it's then considered to be a matter of national security, which this was, they will do whatever is asked of them. If it is, you will be flying to the moon, you won't actually get there, but you will persuade people that you have been there. Yes, sir, would have been their response. They're military. And you mentioned the Apollo 11 press conference, which is probably the most revealing of these things, that you can put people under enormous pressure and persuade them that they have to lie in public. And most people will not be able to do it convincingly unless they're a trained actor. And these men were not trained actors, they were trained astronauts.
So them being military men, I can understand that. And so then the follow-up to that would be, What about the NASA employees? I mean, there were hundreds, thousands of people who were also a part of the process. I do get specialization and compartmentalization, your piece of it. But there has to be, if there was a cover-up of that magnitude, there had to be people who knew.
There were people who knew. There would have to have been people who knew. It is always said that 400,000 people were working for the Apollo program at the time that it occurred. And that's probably correct. I mean, we're talking all the companies spread around America, from Boeing in Washington State to Lockheed in California to the control centers in Texas to the manufacturers of Spacesuit. We mentioned that's in Connecticut, right across America. And that was a deliberate policy of NASA at the time to involve as many people and as diverse a people as possible so that it would be supported. And it was supported. There's no doubt about that. You mentioned compartmentalization, which is you know enough to do your own job,
right,
and you don't need to know about anybody else. So the people in Seattle building the rockets wouldn't have known what the people in Florida were doing at the launch site. So though there were 400,000 people in total, they didn't need to keep a secret. There was no secret to keep. They were just doing what they had to do. One comparison on this is the Manhattan Project of the 1940s. The development and construction of the atom bomb, which was eventually dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
Until the bomb went off, nobody knew what was going on. Secrets can be kept. There were 1 million people involved in the D-Day landings in June 1944. Secret didn't get out until they landed.
Right.
Then all hell broke loose. But that's another story.
Do you put, or what have you heard, or do you put any weight at all? There's kind of an alternate theory that the reason in reality that we have not returned to the moon isn't that necessarily they faked the trip, but instead because of what was found on the moon when they arrived. And I don't know if if that's way too far out there for you. There are like a hollow moon theory, things like that when they arrived, there were alien spacecraft or structures on the moon that they were not expecting. And that may have been part of the reason that they also chose not to return.
That's a point which I've heard raised many times, and it's certainly one of those intriguing aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
If we could get there so easily with the technology of the 1960s, why on earth haven't we been back? Well, one answer could be we were ordered off.
Right.
Collect some rocks, wave a few flags, and get out. You're not welcome here. Could have been the answer. And you mentioned the hollow moon. There is debate as to whether the moon is a solid structure.
Right.
Or is it a hollow sphere? If it's a hollow sphere and it keeps one face towards Earth at all times, which we know it does, because we can't see the far side of the moon, if ET exists and ET is watching Earth, what a wonderful place for him to live, because he can come in and leave and go out from the far side of the moon without being spotted by anybody, do what he has to do here on Earth, and there have been enough sightings of unidentified craft on Earth to make one at least think that something is happening. Where they're coming from is another matter. But if he lives in the moon, isn't this a logical place for him to be? And is the moon artificial?
Right.
Could it be a constructed satellite deliberately placed in orbit around Earth to create the environment and conditions for life on Earth to exist as we know it today? Because if you took the moon away, what would happen? Well, there'd be no tides, most people would say.
And the orbit of the moon also actually stabilizes the rotation of the Earth as well. I mean, it actually has a huge stabilizing force on the Earth itself, and there could be some severe weather issues without the moon around. Maybe that's a whole different conversation. I would love to have it. I've actually had a podcast on that before. I really do enjoy space and kind of talking about it. And I definitely thank you so much, Marcus. We've really kind of run quite a bit over, but the conversation was so good, I just kind of kept it going. So,
well, thank you.
So thank you for joining the show today and providing me a truly unique view on the topic. I think it has been a great conversation. I would love to do it again and put a little bit more time into the photographic evidence and the film evidence that we touched on it a bit, but we were more dealing with the science today. I would also love to talk about ancient Egyptians. I saw that on your website as well, and information on that as well. I would love to talk about that too.
Just one final thing.
Sure.
I mentioned the problem with vacuum and film operating in a vacuum. We're actually conducting tests right now using a vacuum chamber and similar film to that which was used on Apollo to see what effect a vacuum has over a period of time. And the initial tests appear to indicate that the film is actually damaged in a vacuum. So that is ongoing at the moment. So if anybody listening has access to a vacuum chamber that can pull a vacuum similar to the level that exists on the moon, stick a film in it, film we're talking about, not digital, film, and see what happens. And if it doesn't work, well, we've got a problem with Apollo, haven't we?
Absolutely. So do you have a new book out or anything else, a website that you wanted to promote, anything else that you wanted to direct listeners to that they can find out more information?
Okay. There's a very good website for a great deal of the subjects that, a great deal more about the subjects that we've been discussing here. It's called Owlis. I'll spell that, A for Apple, ULIS.com. Owlis.com. It's based in the UK, but it's been going for well over 25 years and has accumulated an incredible amount of very good factual information, some of it from Soviet scientists, from Russian scientists, filmmakers, photographers, people who are interested in the whole Apollo deception problem and are trying to unravel it. So that's owlis.com. Certainly recommend that.
Okay.
If anybody wants to contact me, if you go to the nexusmagazine.com website, you can contact me there through the contact button. Certainly like to hear from anybody. If you've got any points to raise, you want any brickbats to throw at me, or tell me I'm wrong, let me know I'm wrong, but prove it. Don't just make rude remarks and do ad hominem attacks, which is what normally happens. And as soon as anybody does that, I just delete it because there's no point.
People get very, very emotional. I mean, it's a very emotional topic for sure. Maybe this and 9/11 attacks are probably the two biggest triggers of emotion that I've ever been a part of.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary the lengths to which people will go to try to defend a position which they're not prepared to defend scientifically. Right. That's all I ask.
It's all feeling.
Prove me wrong. I mean that's what your program is called.
That's
Prove
right.
me wrong.
That's exactly right.
So just do it, but be polite about it. There's no need to be rude. There's no need to be unpleasant. If I'm wrong, I want to know I'm wrong, and I'm not prepared to listen to ad hominem attacks. They're just waste of space.
Well, once again, everybody, thank you, Marcus Allen. I really appreciate that. Again, he gave you some good websites, some good information. I would love to do this again if you're available for some of those other topics. Appreciate you joining the show.
Delighted to be able to do so, Pete, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very flattered that you consider that I have sufficient information to be able to entertain your audience.
Absolutely. No, you answered all my questions, that's for sure. I've been burrowing into my brain for quite a while, and I was glad to get them out.
That's good. And anybody who has any more questions, let me know, and we'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And so once again, that is Marcus Allen. That was quite a conversation about the moon landings. We could have probably gone on about that for another 2-3 hours. We got to the point where I just kind of looked at that and said, we need to start wrapping it up. We have a lot of information. We really didn't get into the photography, the photos. I think that has really been things that have been tread and retread. And there's a lot of information about that out there that you can Google yourself. You can look at those photographs. You can look at the films. You can see what I'm talking about when guys are bouncing around and falling down and very cavalier with the way they're moving on the surface of the moon. It's amazing. So if you have any questions about anything that you've heard today, or you want to contact us, you can do so by email. You can contact us on provemerongcast@gmail.com. That's our email address. You can also contact us through our Facebook page. The Facebook page is titled Just Prove Me Wrong. You can search for it on Facebook. We also have an Instagram page, Prove Me Wrong, as well. If you're just trying to find the podcast, you can find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, Tunein Radio, Spotify, podcast app. Really, anywhere that you find podcasts, you can find the Prove Me Wrong podcast. Also, go online and like us on Facebook. Subscribe to our SoundCloud page. That's really how we kind of get an idea of who's listening and really make it easier for us to get some feedback from all of you. And before we take off here today, I do want to say that this episode of the Prove Me Wrong podcast is brought to you once again by ZendoZones citronella burners from JT Eaton. They are shaped like fearless little tiki gods, so let Sturf and Stan, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with ZendoZones citronella burners. ZendoZones uses natural 3% citronella candles and incense cones, perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolsides, the surface of the moon, maybe, and more. You can enjoy the outdoors again. They are now available on Amazon and at Ace Hardware, and you can collect them all today. So once again, for my guest, Marcus Allen, this has been the Prove Me Wrong podcast. I'm Pete Lieb. We'll talk to you again soon.